All right. Excellent.
And we can see the notification this session is being recorded, so it looks like all is good.
Great. We are, for all attendees, welcome to the Northwest Energy Coalition Resource Adequacy in the Northwest webinar. We are just getting started. We're going to wait as people are added into the webinar. Give it a few more minutes. Okay. We have, we're very appreciative of our panelists. We had originally intended to do this webinar in Montana live, or actually this presentation live in Montana. Again, my name is Nancy Hirsch, the Executive Director of the Northwest Energy Coalition. Thank you very much for being with us. And just the coalition is a nonprofit advocacy organization of over 100 member organizations, from public interest organizations, environmental, consumer, low-income service organizations, energy efficiency and renewable energy companies, and electric and natural gas utilities. We advocate for clean energy, affordability and equity across the Pacific Northwest. And just to make sure it's clear, GoToWebinar, we will, you are all muted. We're going to try and use the chat box. There's on your GoToWebinar, there's a questions button on the instructions, as you can see, and you can type your question in there. We're going to try and be very interactive in the way this webinar works. So we have 3 presenters and a moderator, and they will each make their presentation, and then we'll pause for questions from the audience. And when we're done, Coalition staffer Fred Hewitt will lead the panelists through questions, as well as take your questions. So you can also use the raise hand feature, as well as the type in a question. So we have about 55 participants at the moment. I expect that to grow a little bit as we proceed, but I think we're gonna move ahead with our presentation. Thank you all very much for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Fred. And I also wanted to mention we're recording this, and we will post not only the slides, but the recording on our website when we're done.
Well, hi, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon. I'm Fred Hewitt, staff for the Northwest Energy Coalition based in Portland. Very happy to have all of you on here, and very pleased to have our 3 panelists. We're talking today about resource adequacy, and we'll talk a little bit at the beginning about what that actually means and why it's become a big conversation item in the Northwest concerning our electric power system. Just to start with, the Northwest system is changing rapidly. We have coal plants starting to retire, renewable energy resources, demand side resources and storage are growing, and we're anticipating electrification of transportation and buildings going forward. So we have a real opportunity in Northwest to be a leader nationally in embracing all of those changes and having a resource mix that provides an equitable, carbon-free electric system that's smart, controllable, affordable, and efficient, or as I always like to say, reliable, clean, and affordable. Resource adequacy is basically, and I'm sure all of our speakers will talk about this, is an approach that says, do you have enough electric system resources, generation, demand side, storage, to meet demand in every hour or in every time interval throughout the year? And this is a very important thing to do because we have to be sure that we have the right set of resources given their varying characteristics across all different kinds of electric resources that we can use to meet that load and make sure the lights stay on. Nothing could highlight the importance of this more than the current health crisis, where the health system relies not only on electric power for equipment, but also for all the devices that connect to the internet, which in turn is also completely dependent on electric system reliability and resource adequacy. The current approach to resource adequacy shows that the Northwest is at risk of reliability problems, particularly as coal plants retire. Some say, however, that that observation is based on an old way of looking at resource adequacy and doesn't really fully represent the way that actual system planning is done. So as that backdrop, I'd like to introduce first, briefly mention our three panelists, and then we'll go have each of them make an opening comment. And we'll follow each one of those with questions for those panelists. And then we'll have a series of questions for the panel. After each question, we'll again open the floor. And then at the end, we'll have an open discussion. So first we have, our first speaker will be Ben Coela. He's the Director of Power Planning at the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. Secondly, we have Elaine Hart, the Manager of Resource Planning at Portland General Electric. And third, we have Therese Hampson, who's the Executive Director of the Public Generating Pool. So all that said, I'd like to turn it over to Ben.
Let me first make sure I unmute myself. I'll try to keep this pretty brief because I think the questions are the most interesting part. So go ahead and go on to the next slide. I just want to provide a little bit of baseline information about resource adequacy in the Northwest and why it's a little bit different maybe than where it is elsewhere and some of the particular challenges we have. So one of the first things that I always like to point out about the Northwest is we're different because of the predominance of our hydro system. So when you look at the amount of water that runs off through the Columbia system, it can vary quite a bit. Pretty much anywhere from around 50% of the electricity we use to around 90% of the electricity we use in the region can be provided by hydro. And so that amount changes depending on precipitation, depending on snowpack and when things run off, depending on a lot of factors. But one of the things that we have as a unique challenge in the Northwest is we could go for multiple years without having a lot of resources in the ground supporting resource adequacy. And if we have a really good hydro year and a lot of generation out of our hydro system, it might not present itself as a problem for us, but it's something that we need to be aware of because you never know when the hydro year is not going to be a good hydro year. So I always just like to start out saying, we have a little bit of a different problem than almost everywhere else in the US because of the predominance of hydro here and how much of our generation it supplies. So go on to the next slide. And that's also reflected here. So when you look at the amount of generation on average, hydro is about half of what we get in the region. And this is generation. So when you're talking about generally the Northwest, we are producing more power than we use because we generally are exporting power out of the region to other places like California or up to British Columbia or other places like that. So generally when we're looking at the generation that we produce in this region, hydro is about half of it. So that's just to add a little bit of showing how big of a part of our resource hydro is. So go ahead and go on. The other thing that hydro does is it can complicate a little bit when you talk about other resources and you're adding in. So this is just an example that I pulled out of something we've done in the past. But when you're adding in a solar resource to the system, it doesn't just add power on top of what's going. All the other resources respond to adding that resource in. So here you see we have a little bit of an example of putting a pretty big solar curve into a resource adequacy model that's trying to measure these things. And what you see happens is the hydro system responds. It increases the amount of generation when the solar is not generating, and it decreases when it is. The thermal system can be different in the way that it responds in terms of natural gas plants or coal plants. In this case, what we saw was overall a pretty large drop in the thermal system. So the flexibility in the hydro system is part of the resource adequacy picture, but also the way the thermal system responds. So you can't take any individual resource as just something providing adequacy. It interacts with all the existing resources out there, and that's all part of the picture whenever we're talking about resource adequacy. Go ahead and go on to the next slide. So Fred already mentioned this. I'm not going to harp on it too much. But when you look at the upcoming challenges that we have, one of the biggest ones is the amount of coal retirement that we have coming out of our system. So here in the Northwest, there's been plenty of things announced. Of course, we know Boardman and Centralia are slated to be, Centralia 1 are slated to be off by the end of this year. You go on and you see we've had announcements about Valmy. Certainly Bridger has dates that have been floated as early as 2023, the second part of Centralia and the second part of Valmy in 25. There's outstanding questions about Colstrip given the legislation in Washington and the legislation in Oregon that have kind of put dates on when people might be looking to exit those projects. It's hashed because of course there's still a lot of discussion going on. But we have a large number of retirements that are coming in the next decade from coal. Go ahead and go on to the next one. And that's not in isolation because the entire West has a huge number of retirements in the coal fleet going on. If you look beyond our borders, we're actually probably having fewer coal retirements than maybe the desert Southwest and a lot of other places. So the entire balance of the Western grid, which is one big machine, we're connected to every single piece of the West, is showing a huge amount of coal plants that are going to be coming off in the probably next 20 years, really. But even the next decade is going to be a very dynamic time. A lot of things are going to change over the next decade when it comes to the amount of coal in our system. And we want to make sure that we have the resources that are there and available to make sure that the system remains adequate and is able to serve the load that we have. And so this kind of is at a high level the circumstances that we're going into and why I think the Northwest is unique and kind of something that you need to be paying attention to when we talk about resource adequacy. We have unique challenges from the hydro side. We have a lot of thermal retirements that are slated to happen and a system that's completely in transition. And that's interesting and dynamic and challenging all at the same time. So that's what I had. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Ben. I wonder if, Nancy, if we have any questions for Ben?
I am not seeing any questions.
Okay, we'll wait a moment here before moving on.
And also raise your hand and I can unmute you. Again, that's up under the attendees. You can click on your raised hand.
Okay, if we don't have any at this point, then I think we should move on. So our next speaker is Elaine Hart from Portland General Electric.
We do have a question. Are you
okay, hold on. Yeah, go ahead.
Are you all aware of the resource adequacy suggestion in the legislature? In which legislature are you referring to? Hang on, let me see if I can unmute you. Okay. Atul, I've unmuted you.
Okay, Washington State had a bill that was put forward to look at resource adequacy. And are you folks going to be contributing to that effort?
This is around the CETA legislation, particularly the Clean Energy Transformation Act, sorry.
That was given as the reason for looking at it. It's an issue regardless.
Yeah, we've been very closely following the rulemaking and trying to keep track of what's going on regarding that particular piece of legislation. And we do definitely talk to Commerce and talk to the UTC on a regular basis and try to make sure that we're coordinating and giving our best understanding of what's going on in support of the efforts that are going on in Washington State. Then the council is a broader organization, so Washington is one of the 4 states that makes up the council. Certainly Oregon, Idaho, Montana are the other 3. So we try to keep our eyes on all of the efforts that are going on in each of the states. So I certainly could get you in touch with our Washington state staff, and they'd be able to give you even more details than that. Elizabeth Osborne has been deeply. So, but if you want, you can drop me an email and I'll make sure to make that connection.
Okay, thank you, Atul. Michael O'Brien has a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Nancy. Ben, you used the phrase resource a lot when talking about resource adequacy. I was just wondering if you have a rule of thumb, or what counts as a resource and what doesn't count as a resource, or what makes something a resource that contributes to resource adequacy, in your opinion?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that's a great question, in that I think the Northwest has a long history of being very open and very broad in what we think of as resources. So energy efficiency, demand side resources that happen to be something like rooftop solar, or maybe demand response where you're doing something to change load patterns. All of those are various things that I would group into a portfolio of things that can respond to the need. Ultimately, you know, you can use terminology about what we call resources and what we don't, but the important part is how can we make sure that we meet the need that's out there? And if there's a way to do that on the demand side, or if there's a way to do that on the utility scale side, you want to take all those into account and look for what's the best answer that you can get out, making sure that we're aware of the fact that it has implications for what people need to pay for electricity. It has that sort of affordable implication that Fred was talking about. So we want to look at all the resources available and understand the benefits of them. They each have unique characteristics. There's no way to make a perfect apples to apples comparison from one technology to the other, but you kind of have to blend them together and get really good answers and indications of where you can go. So I would say that it's a very broad area. I don't think it's just looking at a bunch of thermal plants or maybe just utility side plants. You're looking at all sort of things that can be brought to bear on the problem together in a kind of blended area and a blended portfolio.
Okay, great, thank you. Carolyn Whitney has the last question in this round, and then we're going to move on to our next speaker. I unmuted you.
Oh, I was just wondering if you're doing analysis on taking out the Snake River dams with the man and with the mountain.
So the council has not started any analysis like that directly at this point. It's something that a lot of people are talking about right now. I understand it's an issue that a lot of people have interest in. Right now, we are continuing to follow the EIS, as is a lot of other organizations, and getting information, trying to understand what's underlying that. But right now, we haven't kicked off any particular effort to study removal of the lower snakes.
All right, great. Thank you so much. I'll turn it back to you, Fred.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. There were some good questions. And now we want to move on to Elaine Hart from PGE.
Thanks, Fred. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, you're fine.
Excellent, thanks. I've got a couple of slides here. I'm going to try to be brief, but I think what I wanted to do is walk through a little bit of a high-level overview of what we do to address resource adequacy. In the Pacific Northwest, resource adequacy is largely addressed through the individual utility planning and procurement processes. And so the integrated resource plan and the process around the integrated resource plan at PGE is sort of the primary tool that we have for addressing resource adequacy. Every utility approaches this in a little bit of a different way because it depends on the specific needs of the customers in their service area, and it depends on what types of resources are available to meet those needs. But I'm happy to talk about what we do, and I just want to sort of acknowledge that your local utility might do this in a little bit of a different way. So at PGE, we use a probabilistic model. We take a look at different periods of time and try to understand the probability that electricity demand will be at certain levels during that period of time, and also the probability that the resources that we have available are going to be operating and available and able to serve that electricity demand in those periods of time. As a result of that analysis, we get a sort of a view of where we have resource adequacy needs and where we're probably okay in terms of having enough capability on the system. And the picture here on the right of the slide, this is our loss of load heat map. Across the top there, those are months of the year, and then going down in the vertical are hours of the day. And you can see here that those hours that are red are those hours where we sort of expect or anticipate that we're more likely to be in a constrained situation because of both a combination of how high electricity loads are during those hours and the availability of our resources during those hours. So in Portland, we're a double peaking system. We peak both in the winter and the summer because we have pretty high heating loads on those cold winter days, and we increasingly also have high cooling loads on hot summer days. And so you see that show up in this picture. You see in January and in December, we have resource adequacy needs both in the morning when people wake up and they turn their furnaces on, or in my case, my heat pump on. You go turn on your coffee pot, all of that. And then there's limited capability for the system to necessarily respond to those peaks. So that's a key period that we focus on. And then also at night when people get home from work and they turn their appliances on, they turn their thermostat back up, that's also a period of constraint for us. And then if you look a little bit to the right of that red area and in the winter, take a look at July and August, we also see that as you get really warm on some of those July and August days, you're also putting the system under stress. So the ability of resources to sort of be available and react in these sorts of situations when the system is constrained determines the contribution of those resources to meeting your resource adequacy needs. We call that our capacity contribution. And when we look at all of our resources, we have to stack them up and figure out how many more would we need in order to meet some reliability standard. Every utility has a different reliability standard that they plan to. Some of them use the same standard, but it sort of depends on the jurisdiction, sort of how you are required to plan. At PGE, we plan to a standard of no more than 2.4 expected hours per year, where resources would not be able to meet loads, plus some additional contingency margin on top of that. But there are a lot of different standards that you can apply. The standard that's applied by the Power Council looks a little bit different. Standards that are applied in other parts of the country look a little bit different as well. If you want to go to the next slide. So this is another way of kind of looking at our resource adequacy needs. And this information is all taken from the 2019 IRP, and I'll caveat that there are some approximations layered in here so you can see things broken out in a way that we don't usually break it out. But the idea is that you stack up those capacity contributions of all the stuff you have in your portfolio. You compare that to your peak load, and then you add on a buffer on top of that. And that buffer is pretty important because it accounts for the fact that you might have different weather conditions across different years. You might have more or less cold snaps or cold snaps of different severity or heat waves in one year from another. And so you have to be able to plan to accommodate those fluctuations, very similar to the types of fluctuations that Ben highlighted with hydro. So the bars here that you see on the graph show when we stack up all of our resources that we've already secured, that were already either in the ground or secured through contracts or through customer programs, how much of that total need we're able to meet. And then in our integrated resource planning process, we look at the gap and we try to figure out the best way in Oregon from a cost and risk perspective to fill in that gap. I'll note that if you take a look at those bars, at least on our system, the dominant contributors to resource adequacy are still these sort of traditional centralized dispatchable resources. We don't rely on hydro as much as other utilities in the Northwest, but we still have a fair amount that's provided by hydro. We have a lot, and the majority, I'd say the largest share, is provided by natural gas plants. I click on the next. Here we go. Moving forward, though, the picture looks pretty different. So if you take a look at our 2019 IRP, the strategy that we're employing to fill that gap looks pretty different than sort of the strategies that we've employed in the past. What we find is that from both a cost and risk perspective, it makes sense to meet our customer loads, the incremental loads that aren't met with what we've already got, with new technologies, renewables, wind and solar, with energy storage, with additional customer programs or distributed energy resources, and to some extent also contracts with existing resources within the region. So how can we best leverage what the region already has before we go out and invest in new infrastructure? This is predominantly where the conversation is going for us in terms of meeting resource adequacy needs. And that means that we have new challenges that we need to address in quantifying the capabilities of all those technologies, new programs. These things behave very differently from traditional resources. In particular, we've spent a lot of time, I'd say, over the last 10 years doing a good job understanding how variable renewables, wind and solar can contribute to capacity needs. We know less about storage. We know less about demand response. These are really complicated these are really complicated resources. And so a lot of our focus, I think, over the next couple of years is going to be around better quantifying how those resources contribute to our portfolio, particularly around resource adequacy. With that, I'm going to end here with a shameless plug for our IRP process. We just wrapped up our 2019 IRP, and we are getting started on our next IRP. And one of the primary components of that process is a stakeholder input process that's currently underway. And so if you want to go one more slide. If you're interested in these topics, if you're interested in capacity contributions and loss of load probabilities and resource adequacy and all that, I encourage you to take a look at our website or shoot us an email. I would be happy to add you to our email list or invite you to participate in our stakeholder meetings.
All right, thanks, Elaine. I just want to mention, by the way, that the Oregon Public Utility Commission just last night issued their acknowledgement order on the 2019 IRP. And I haven't read all of it yet, but it looks pretty good. And they specifically praised Portland General Electric and Elaine's team for doing a lot of innovative work to look at issues like resource adequacy and a lot of other pieces of the puzzle. So Nancy, I wonder if we have any questions for Elaine.
We do, and I'll turn first to Hannah Cruz. I've unmuted you if you want to ask your question.
Great, thank you. This is to the chart you showed indicating the various sources to fill up to where your capacity need is. And I was curious what will fill the gap left when coal comes off the utilities system?
Yeah, it'll depend. So it'll depend a lot on sort of where technology is at that time. One thing that I want to note here is that the error bars, there are error bars on this graph. They're not shown, but they're quite large, and they depend on a lot of factors, including how economic conditions evolve in the future, how much capacity we're able to secure from other resources within the region. And also in terms of that breakdown between storage versus wind and solar, how much of our needs we fill with different types of technologies, all that is going to depend on how sort of technology development and cost declines in those resources continue to evolve into the future. So our goal is to be sort of flexible and nimble enough to take advantage of those technology improvements as they arise. And hopefully what we're able to do is as resources start to come out of our stack, we're able to take advantage of those resources that are sort of best able, at least cost, at least risk, meet those needs as they're coming out. So it's, you know, we come back and we do these plans every couple of years, and every couple of years the situation has evolved a little bit, and so it's hard to say, oh, at that specific period in time those are the types of resources we're going to go after. But I guess the answer is we're constantly looking at it, and our IRP process is where all that happens.
We have another question from Terry Oliver. You've unmuted, Terry.
Is Portland General looking at the experience of other utilities as well as understanding in order to understand the performance of these new resources? And if so, which utilities?
Oh, that's a really good question. We review other IRPs, in particular other IRPs in the region, but I think we've predominantly leveraged data and experience from our own system and trying to characterize DERs and their contribution. In particular, we've got a smart grid test bed that we've got going right now, where we're really looking forward to getting on the ground experience that we can use to inform our quantification of those capabilities in the future. But if there are specific utilities where you've seen them do a really great job on those types of characterizations, please let us know and we'd be happy to look into it.
Okay, Brad Cooper is the next question. Brandon, you're on.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're fine. Go ahead.
So I'm just curious, what's your it looks like, just looking at your chart, roughly what, 600 megawatts of capacity need, and I'm just curious how much, DER storage, wind, solar, additional contracts will you have to acquire to fill that capacity need? Is it a one-for-one exchange?
It totally it totally depends on the technology. So what I've shown here in this graph is sort of a blown out capacity contribution based on our IRP analysis, but the actual number of megawatts that you need is quite a bit larger than the capacity contributions, because wind, solar, and even storage, it's not a one-for-one replacement in terms of their capacity. So we could be seeing resources that are coming in at closer to 20% for wind and solar, up to 30%, depending on the resource type. We could also see energy storage closer to 60 to 80%. And so it's actually, to fill a 700 megawatt capacity storage, it's a fair amount of megawatts of new resources that you'd need to leverage in order to meet that. I'll say this is our snapshot for 2025, so we've got some time to get there. And also there's sort of, in particular, when we're leveraging new technologies, there's some value in sort of taking incremental bites as you go. So we've got sort of a set of processes that we'll be able to undertake over the next couple of years to eat into that 700 megawatts through bilateral negotiations and through RFPs.
Let's do one more question of a hand raised, and then the other questions we're going to save until we get through Teresa's comments. So, Julie Dombia, I'm unmuting you. Go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, great. Hope you can hear me. Roughly, what was the magnitude of load adjustment for EE for this figure?
That depends on how you define sort of the counterfactual.
Okay.
I'll have to go back and take a look, but I want to say that at least on an energy basis, it's about 150 average megawatts of energy efficiency. Energy efficiency has a shape though, and so to the extent that it's aligning well with the shape of our load, the capacity contribution could be a bit higher than that. We don't actually go out and separately, this is a great flag too, because I've got a little asterisk about the load being adjusted for energy efficiency. We don't actually go out and subtract the effects of energy efficiency from our load and do a separate resource adequacy analysis in the IRP. So the best we can kind of do is ballpark it. I know in the future, we're going to be taking a look a little bit more closely about whether there's additional energy efficiency beyond the energy trust forecast that could be applied and would make sense within a least cost, least risk portfolio. And that effort will certainly require that we sharpen the pencil a little bit on the capacity contribution of energy efficiency in our portfolio. But I'd say it's on the order of about 150, but probably a little bit higher than that for capacity contribution. And that's incremental to what we've already sort of secured. If you try to back out all of the energy efficiency that we've undertaken, over the last couple of decades, it's a much, much, much larger number.
Okay, we're going to hold the rest of the questions. Write them down if you, and we're going to move back to Fred.
And just to mention that if you have questions that we don't have time to address, now put them in the chat box or send them to us afterwards. and we'd be happy to follow up and have our panelists respond. So your questions will always, we'll try to answer all of them. So thanks again, Elaine. And now from the investor-owned utility side, we're now going to go to the public power side, and with Therese Hampton. So go ahead.
Thanks, Fred, and thanks for the invitation to talk with you a little bit today. What I'm going to talk about is lay out some of the reasoning, maybe not all of the reasoning, for an effort that's being undertaken by the Northwest Power Pool to contemplate a regional resource adequacy program. So as Elaine mentioned, currently resource adequacy is evaluated by each utility individually, and there's some consideration and exploration of looking at that on a regional level. The slide that's noted here is a slide maybe some of you have seen, maybe you haven't, but it was produced by a consulting firm, E3, for the Northwest Power Pool, kind of looking at the different resource adequacy studies that have been done in the last year to identify the resource adequacy in generally the Northwest. The footprint is different under each of these scenarios. And I'm not showing this slide, which can see it's got time across the x-axis and the amount of surplus or deficit of resource capability relative to peak load forecasts for each of the different studies. And I'm showing this not because they're all kind of showing a deficit, but that there are 5 different forecasts. And they're pretty significant in the range that they're showing of the forecasted deficits, anywhere from 500 to 3,000 megawatts of difference. And that really kind of prompts the conversation about possibly the need for a regional approach. Is why are these different? Some of them look at different footprints, but really some of the bigger differences are around what do you assume is your peak demand? How do you assess the probability or the risk that you're willing to take? Elaine mentioned that they talk about 2.4 hours a year. People look at that differently. How are you going to evaluate how resources might contribute? Different utilities look at that differently. But then probably most importantly, as we're moving into deficit scenarios, what can you rely on other utilities for when they have surplus? What might be available to help you out when you might have a peak situation? Every utility system, certainly on the west side, they end up with peak demand issues at a different time than east side utilities, and so how much you rely on their surplus. So all of those different kind of assumptions have led the Northwest Power Pool members, a subset of Northwest Power Pool utilities, to consider, is there something they might want to do collectively? And if we go to the next slide, it isn't a new idea. It's actually something that's done in many other parts of the country. And so they're looking at some of the other parts of the country to see what could be considered for the power pool utilities. On the left-hand side of this graph, it's kind of small, or of this slide, it's kind of small, but it's the highlighted areas are different organized markets that also have an organized resource adequacy program where they look at adequacy for that entire footprint. And there's several different ways they do it. The ones that are in gray, the California ISO and the Southwest Power Pool, they have what we refer to as a bilateral resource adequacy program, where they look at the peak demand or the peak needs over that footprint, and then allocate responsibility to the different load serving entities or utilities within the footprint. And they all have a common method for counting the resources that can contribute to that. So the Northwest Power Pool members have kind of looked at those programs to see, is there something that we could apply to the Northwest Power Pool footprint, which is there on the right, the blue, roughly the blue portion of the Northwest Power Pool footprint. The conversations have been about utilities could volunteer, they could choose to be a part of the program. They wouldn't have to be a part of the program, but they could choose to be a part of the program. So this is kind of the conversation that's underway. What I wanted to talk about next, and I probably should have started with the first caveat. What I'm about to talk about is the benefits of a program like this. I'm not representing any specific Northwest Power Pool member in this, or even any of the specific PGP members in this, but these are the conversations that folks have when they think about whether there's a benefit to a coordinated, organized program. So if we go to the next slide, the next slide is actually, there's kind of a lot of information in this, but I'm going to break it down a bit for you. This was developed for a Northwest Power Pool symposium to kind of explore the potential of a program like this. And there's a couple of major benefits that they see in having a regional program. The first is that there's this independent method of determining the amount of capacity needed for regional resource adequacy. So sometimes there are a lot of questions that get raised about whether it's in an individual utility planning process or in other processes. Is that really the need that they have? Is that the right measure of capacity? Is that the right resource contribution? By moving to a regional program, you really create this independent administrator that can execute the process of identifying the needs and the contributions of the different resources. And then everybody has that information. The second benefit is that you really do get to take advantage of load and resource diversity across the footprint. So where Elaine was talking about, they're having a certain situation in the winter. Well, if they're in partnership with utilities on the east side, whether it's Idaho or Utah or otherwise, and they're not having a similar need, then they can share their resources with PGE, and they don't have to specifically build for that situation. So when you plan when you plan for peak demands over a broader footprint, you sometimes don't have the same needs when you're sharing that surplus. And then the third thing that they found is where you might see your peak demands, let's just use rough numbers, as 100 megawatts. You're going to put a little buffer on that. Maybe it's 15%. If you're planning over a large period, you might not actually have a need for such a large margin as 15%. You might have the ability to drop that down to 12%. And so what you see in the box is the potential benefits. What it all comes down to is, can we reduce the amount of new build that might be needed if you're in a deficit situation? Can we reduce the amount of new build that might be needed? And these are very rough estimates that were done, but if you go to the table on the far right, for the Northwest Power Pool, it's estimated that you could see as high as a 3,500 megawatt to 4,600 megawatt reduction in capacity need just by planning over a common footprint. And if we go to the next slide, this is underscored by some work that they've done in the Southwest Power Pool. They've actually implemented this over the last several years, and the Southwest Power Pool has shown that they've reduced their planning reserve margin from what was 15% down to 12%, just by broadening the footprint that they were operating within, where the footprint where they applied the resource adequacy program. And for them, that was $90 million of deferred capacity investment. So one of the benefits here is that as we see the region moving into a capacity deficit situation, because the resource mix is changing, we have the ability to use both the existing resources and the new resources much more efficiently by planning over a broader footprint. The other benefit is that you just have a clearer picture and a more consistent picture of what your need is. What is the capacity need? Where's the real peak need? And what are the resources that can best fill that need? If we go to the last slide, just to give a little bit of sense of the timeline on the Northwest Power Pool effort, it's in the exploratory stage right now. So this is something that, looking at best practices or practices that are used in other parts of the country, is that something that could be done here? We're in early preliminary design phase, and there's still a lot of work to do, but wanted to just make you aware of some of the efforts there to look into a program like this.
Okay.
All right, thanks again, Therese. Yeah, go ahead, Nancy.
Great. I just want to acknowledge that there were some questions in the queue, but those were for Elaine. And I'm gonna call on Doug Howell had a question for Therese. Hold on, Doug, let me unmute you. There we go. Doug, you're unmuted.
Therese, it sounded like you were talking about an ISO or RTO app, but you didn't say that, so I just wasn't sure what you were trying to get at.
Oh, thanks. That's a great question. No, actually, I should have said, so in the other parts of the country that is implemented typically by an ISO or RTO, but there is every belief that it can be done without an ISO or RTO function. You would need some kind of independent administrator, but it doesn't have to be an ISO or an RTO necessarily.
Okay. We have a question from Kurt Miller.
Hi, thank you. Hey, Therese, great job to you and to Franco Frangi and all those who are working on this effort. I think it's going to be really helpful to the region. The one question I had for you on the slide where you showed the potential benefits is, does that include a look at transmission constraints, or does that assume the transmission constraints are non-existent? I'm just trying to get a sense of how rough of an estimate that is.
Yeah, it's a rough estimate. So transmission and deliverability aspects will be something that needs to be considered. And in most of the other programs, there is kind of a system resource adequacy look, and then you also end up with kind of local resource adequacy when you have certain parts of the system that are transmission constrained, and so you can send a clear message that there's a capacity need and it needs to be met in this specific geographic region.
Okay, great. Last call. Again, I haven't lost the questions that were for Elaine. We'll come back to those a little bit later. Any other questions for Therese before we move to the more prepared questions? All right, Fred, back to you.
All right, thanks to Ben, Elaine, and Therese for a really good intro here. We have 6 questions, and we'll see how far we get through that. I want to make sure we have time at the end for a more open floor Q&A. But I'll go through these, and then any or all of the panelists can respond as you wish. So the first question, and then I should also say after each of these questions, we'll also open up for follow-up questions from the audience. As we said, the Northwest is now in a time where the electric system resource mix is undergoing a lot of change. We have coal retirements, but we also have a lot of quite diverse range of new resources, renewable energy, wind and solar, for example, demand side, energy efficiency and advanced energy efficiency and demand response, rooftop solar, et cetera, and storage resources. Given those new opportunities, but also the uncertainties, particularly on the timing of some of the coal retirements, how can we incorporate this kind of forward-looking clean energy vision into the resource adequacy analysis? So I don't know who might want to start. Any of our panelists want to take a swing at that?
I guess
I'll start off. Oh, Elaine, go. Please, you're probably the better person. I was waiting for you.
I can talk about sort of what we do and what we're thinking about for the future on this front. So we do, as part of our each IRP, we do get an external sort of consultant to help us understand how customer resources, in particular distributed flexibility, or distributed flexibility is our phrase for anything that's out there that's in the system that we have some ability to sort of dispatch and move around. So this could be demand response, it could be a customer storage resource that they've allowed us to move around at times to help meet system needs. Those types of resources. So we've gone out and asked sort of outside experts to give us an indication or forecast for how much of that stuff we expect to start to be incorporated into our system. And then we bake all of that into our analysis from the very beginning. So we're only looking at meeting that portion of our needs that remains after all of that stuff is expected to show up on the grid. The challenge is it's really uncertain. So customer decisions are really hard to forecast over the long term. And then the other challenge is that this ideally would be iterative, that we don't just take that as input information and then solve for everything else, but we also ask the question, okay, now that we have a look at what the alternatives are, how much more of that type of stuff would we wish could come about, and can we design programs to bring more of those types of resources about? And so I'd say we're kind of, we've done a lot of work to try to make sure we can treat those resources appropriately once we get the information and sort of treat it exogenously. And then the next step in our process is to take a more sort of endogenous approach to include sort of those types of resources within our broader sort of portfolio evaluation.
All right, thank you. Ben, did you want to say something?
No, I think that's a very good way of answering the question. I would add that we take a lot of these models and we have to ask a lot of questions from them. And I think that when you're asking about resource adequacy, you don't just ask about that in isolation. You also ask, okay, given constraints on policies that have passed through the states, given targets in terms of carbon reduction, I mean, you look at a lot of different things and you try to find kind of how does that system come together. We are all learning about new technology, but we're all always learning about new technology. I don't think that's a new dynamic. And frankly, even modern gas turbines do things that gas turbines didn't do a long time ago. So I think it's just part of the kind of constant evaluation that we do, is to keep track of the new technology, to keep track of the things, the policies and the constraints that people care about, and make sure that we're taking those into account and kind of testing the boundaries and doing a lot of sort of sensitivity tests when we're looking at resource adequacy. So we've got approaches that we use, and we try to do our best to incorporate those constraints and make sure that we're taking it all into account. We don't do resource adequacy and then set that aside and do another study about what is, clean energy or something like that. We try to blend it all together and do a big analysis that looks at the broad spectrum of what's going on.
Okay, if I could ask a follow-up question, Ben, if you could just say something briefly. The council has really done a lot of work in the last couple of years to look at the capacity contribution or the resource adequacy contribution of not just the generation resources, but also the demand side. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and what the findings are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, so if you start with the history of the Northwest, energy efficiency has had a long history here, and it's been a huge contributor to our system being adequate. And so demand side should not be anything new or astonishing for people to be looking at. I think when we look at things like demand response, there's some particular challenges in terms of, like I said, the hydro system means that you might need to develop a demand response program that if you have good water 10 years in a row, you're not going to need it those 10 years, but you need it the 11th year when you have bad water. And every utility has their own circumstances. So I think they each look at this in their own way. And there's a lot of very mature and well-developed demand responses, all programs already in the Northwest that have been being used by Idaho Power. I think Pacific Core also has some. So, and there's some in public entities as well that have been around for a very long time. I think Mason 3 is one that comes to mind. So I think there's a lot of stuff out there that's been done already. We've got a long history. We've used demand response in the past, and loads change and things move around, but ultimately we want to look at whatever the capacity contribution is, and especially in something that's incremental that you can go out, you can purchase, you can develop. We also want to look at how do you bring that in and how do you make sure that you get the value for it, understanding that it's not a sort of you go out and purchase one machine sort of decision. It's something that takes a different level of sort of coordination and intent, but it can be extremely valuable. Certainly energy efficiency has been extremely valuable to us as a region over the past, 4 decades or more.
Okay, thanks. Therese, do you want to add anything?
No.
Okay.
I think this was one that I really thought was best for the two of them.
Okay, that's fine. Nancy, I wonder if we have any questions in response to this particular issue?
I am going to unmute Raylene Gold.
Oh, I have a question for, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
I had a question for Elaine. I just wondered, Elaine, what are the sources of hydropower for PG&E and how vulnerable are they?
Yeah, thanks for the question. We have a combination of hydro resources. So we have some run-of-river plants sort of on the west side. We have Pelton Round Butte on the east side. And then we also have contracts for additional hydro with some of the other sort of bigger hydro players in the Northwest. The vulnerabilities of those specific resources really, they're pretty different types of resources. And so they'll be different. I'll say that as part of our next IRP, we're going to be looking at it. We're going to be doing a climate adaptation study, and one of the big questions there is how do we expect climate change to affect our hydro resources, their availability, and what is their vulnerability to climate change. So it's an area that we'll be taking a look at sort of more in the future. But you know, they're on different river systems. They have very different circumstances, and so it's a challenging question.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions, Nancy?
I wanted to unmute Phil Barnhart. Phil, you're unmuted. You have some questions? Phil, you're still on mute. Okay, maybe I'll ask his questions. I think I can see them. Phil asks, can we account for the potential load shift away from peak? And how does adding space heat, replacing gas, and transportation electrification, how does that increased load affect peak and thinking about replacement or capacity resources?
Good question. So I will deal with those two things separately because I think they're really different scales of problems. So first of all, transportation is something that, given the turnover of vehicles and given kind of the current capacity of our system, I think there's plenty of room for us to be continuing to electrify transportation, especially personal transportation, without seeing a lot of issues on the electric system. I think in the 7th plan, we forecasted out about 450 average megawatts by the end of a 20-year time frame. We're revisiting that in the current plan, but it is definitely something that I think there's a lot of opportunity for, and I don't think that there's huge barriers to any time too soon. Now you start getting more transportation of like trucking and things like that, then there's going to be infrastructure that needs to be built to accommodate it. But it's just a pretty straightforward, I think, thing that a lot of utilities have already started taking those opportunities, working with busing and things like that. And I think there's lots of opportunity there, and there's not a huge amount of barriers. It's all tends to be about the upfront cost of kind of converting to electric and changing fleets and things like that. Changing other loads, so electrification of natural gas load for heating or something like that is a much larger problem. And it would take a lot of lift to completely switch our natural gas usage in this region to electric. It would be a big expansion of the electric system. So it is something that can be done by policy. There's many different ways to explore it. It's a question we're asking ourselves in this next plan of what would it take. But I do get that question often combined about transportation and building load, and I'd like to kind of split them apart because they're really different scales of problems.
I think our perspective on that might be just a little bit different. I think that, so we did a decarbonization study to support our last IRP where we took a look at what types of transformations would need to occur across the economy to hit these sort of aggressive decarbonization trajectories that the science suggests are going to be necessary, and if anything, they probably need to be more aggressive. And what we saw was that a shift to electricity in several sectors was pretty critical for hitting those types of targets. And so I guess from the utilities perspective, our ask is sort of how quickly do we expect these sorts of changes to happen? How much time do we have to plan for them? Like I said, we do our long-term planning every couple of years. And so usually when you adopt a policy in particular around infrastructure that's showing up in homes and businesses. You don't just sort of flip a switch or snap your finger and all of a sudden everyone's got a heat pump or everyone's got an electric vehicle. It takes time for those customer decisions to trickle into the broader energy system, and that time gives you time to plan and to adjust. So our question is more, how do we make sure that we can accommodate the policies and the customer decisions that may result from those policies in an efficient way as possible? And the primary ways that we're thinking about that, in particular around transportation electrification, but I suspect with building electrification we'll have very similar conversations, is around how can we enable things like smart charging of electric vehicles so that when that load shows up, we have some ability to move it around to those parts of that graph that I pulled up that were green instead of red, so that we can sort of better utilize our existing infrastructure. Things like electric vehicle loads they're kind of ideal for those types of programs, in that they're not correlated. Those loads necessarily don't have to be correlated with all the other loads that we have on the system today. I think heating loads are quite a bit more tricky because they are correlated with the loads that we have today, and so that'll be a whole other suite of problems. And on that point, I think I agree with Ben. I guess from our perspective, we see those changes as happening a little bit more in an evolutionary rather than revolutionary way, and that's probably good, given that we have processes in place to plan as that change occurs.
Okay, thanks. Therese, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just add something. So public generating pool has west side utilities and east side utilities, rural utilities, urban utilities, right? A full mix. And this issue hits the utilities differently. For some, it's an issue, and for some, it's not. And so this is why, some of these regional efforts and looking at things more from a regional perspective, what might be an issue for one, it could be, the solution might just be across the mountains, potentially, if there's transmission, back to Kurt's point, right? If the transmission can get it there. So that's one of the benefits, again, of looking from a regional perspective, is how you might be able to support some of the changes that are happening in other systems.
All right, thanks. Nancy, do we have any more questions on this one?
Tony Belli, you have a question on the metrics we use. Go ahead, Tony.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
So a question to all of the panelists. I'm wondering, given the new resource mix that we see in the future, new demand and so forth, do we have the right metrics? Is loss of load probability still the right metric? Are our concepts of reserve margins the right way to be thinking, or are there other metrics that we should be considering for adequacy?
So I'm going to start off on this one, having a long history with loss of load probability from the council. My background, I should say, I worked on statistics. I came into the power system from looking at things like this, and there is no right metric. There's no way to give you a perfect number that will always describe adequacy for a changing system going forward. And frankly, as much as the council set a standard on loss of load probability, we have looked at dozens of other metrics every single time we've done an adequacy assessment, because there's no way to simplify it down to a single number. So if we saw a system that had a under 5% loss of load probability, but had crazy problems, under really specific circumstances, we would change and adapt our measure of what's appropriate. The loss of load probability of 5% is something that is measured on a set of models that have evolved over time, on a set of assumptions that have evolved over time. You can't take that sort of process of getting a bunch of analysts from the utilities and all the people together who deal with this and talk about it and really hash it over with a simple single metric. It just doesn't work. So I would say, yes, we need to look at all the other metrics. Our threshold right now is set on loss of load probability, but there's many other things that we continue to pay attention to, and we will. And if we see something that causes concerns or that really causes us to shift to something that's more seasonal, to something that is based on, a lost energy need more than the capacity need, or something that takes into account the depth of the potential shortfall, we'll keep our eyes on that, and we'll continue to have that conversation and continue to have it in public with a lot of utilities and a lot of stakeholders involved.
Yeah, if I can offer on this one, so there's certainly, I think, the issue of what's your measure from a capacity perspective, from a peak need. I think as Ben started, we are so hydro dominant here in the Northwest. The energy issue is also, how do you measure that? We kind of measure it with loss of load probability as the Northwest Power Pool effort is looking at other programs. They're all capacity metrics. They don't have an energy metric, so that's something that will have to be considered. But the bigger issue, I think, coming is the flexibility metric. Do you have enough flexible capacity to get you through kind of the transition? If you're heavy in solar, right, as you're transitioning as the solar fades out at the end of the day. So flexibility is really going to be important. We see the California ISO with a flexibility, resource adequacy, and more of those measures are going to be important as well.
Elaine, you got anything to add?
I guess I could add an anecdote on the question of metrics, which I noted in my brief remarks at the beginning that we plan to a loss of load expectation of 2.4 hours per year. The reason that we do that is that 2.4 hours per year is 24 hours every 10 years, which is 1 day in 10 years, which came from a long industry sort of standard approach of quantifying what's good enough when it comes to resource adequacy. But the reason that we translated that into an hours per year metric instead of an event per 10 years or something like that is that the model that we chose to adopt to characterize our needs and our resource capabilities is a time dependent model. So it can't actually tell you how many events you might have had in 10 years. It can only tell you how many hours you might have had a problem in every 10 years. And as we look forward for the types of analysis that we need to be doing, we've identified that as kind of a problem, because a lot of the resources that we're going to increasingly rely upon have really important time-dependent characteristics to them, whether it's energy storage or demand response, whether you've sort of exhausted your ability to go to that resource because of a decision you made a couple of hours ago, starts to be a lot more important. And that's already been important for the other systems in the region that really rely on hydro, for example. But now we're starting to hit the point where we realize that that's going to be a really key determinant of resource adequacy. So we're updating our model, and that means that we're also going to have to re-examine whether we've got the right metric. And so your question is very live in our minds and our plans, and it's always going to be challenging to sort of grapple with it when there's no single industry-wide standard. Usually what it looks like is you try a couple of different standards and you look at how it compares to how you've been doing things in the past, and you try to assess whether or not the new metric is reasonable given sort of your experience and past analysis. And so that's it's a challenging topic, and it's one we'll be grappling with in our next IRP, I think.
I would just note that the council, when they do their annual resource adequacy assessment, has a chart that shows, different kinds of scenarios, low, medium, and high for various things, and they have a color code, red, yellow, green, in part to say that for example, their loss of load probability is not really a precise number. The idea is to say if you see a number that's pretty high, then you have to start really thinking seriously about what you're going to do about it. And I think following what Elaine just said, there are different metrics, and no single one, and also Ben said this, no single one captures the entire range of the issues, and that this is an ongoing, evolving kind of approach to actually get some kind of mathematical representation of the loss of load or the resource adequacy situation. Nancy, do we have any more questions at this point?
Why don't you move on to
Yeah, I'm going to change the order of our questions a little bit here, because actually the next one was going to be about valuing demand-side resources and renewable, and we've already actually addressed that. I also want to come back to a point that Therese made about flexibility. Traditionally, resource adequacy has been concerned about the system performance in a peak hour, the peak hour in the year or the peak hour in a season or a month. And increasingly, we're seeing in a more dynamic system with more variable resources and with changing loads that flexibility, meaning, can the system respond as things change both on the supply and demand side, that might need more attention. So I'm wondering if each of you could say a little bit more about your view about how to incorporate flexibility into the resource adequacy viewpoint.
Oh, I'll leave the hows to Ben and Elaine, and just say that I think we do know that it's important. I mentioned California ISO and the work that they're doing. When we talk to SVP, they're also looking at this, and they're really heavily wind dominated footprint. So we know that that's needed, and I think it's important, especially as being predominantly hydro, to be able to value and put priority on the use of the flexibility of the hydro system for that need. So part of the way I look at some of the benefit of really having the right metrics is not only do we have a clear sense of what's needed if we're lacking something, but how to really prioritize the use of the existing resources we have. So let's not use a resource that might have high flexible capacity just for kind of straight energy if you've got a higher and better use for it. That exactly how to get to those measurements, though, I leave that to the Elaine and Ben. You come up with those great ideas.
So this is a topic that I've personally been grappling with for a long time, and that PGE has been grappling with as well in our last two IRPs in particular, where we did a lot of analysis to look at flexibility adequacy, and we found that it's possible, in particular as we integrate more renewables onto our system, that we will be facing flexibility adequacy challenges. What we haven't been able to wrap our brains around is what's a reasonable standard to plan when it comes to flexibility adequacy. What is the circumstance that you're trying to avoid that you can incorporate into your plannings? And so what we ended up looking at is something that's kind of similar to like an hours per year of challenges type of thing, and then kind of look at how, as you add more flexible resources, it comes down. And at some point, certainly that's good enough, but where is good enough? We haven't had that corollary conversation for flexibility adequacy. And the other thing I'd add is that something that's really challenging with flexibility adequacy is that the amount of flexibility that you have within a given day will depend on a lot of decisions that you've made that are primarily driven by economics. And so it's a much more like multi-dimensional problem than just looking at how much stuff do you have and how much can you count on that stuff. You have to add in the layer of what decisions would I have made with all of that stuff to put me into a position to be able to move up or down at a certain rate. And that's just a very challenging computational question.
Yeah, I think that was actually a really great way to put it. So I think we looked at in the past, we've looked at different ways of modeling the hydro system. And if you took, say, the economic signal away and you just held water as your last resource, you would have a much, much different system than if you continue doing the buying and selling and trading that normally goes on. And so I think you've got to think about how dynamic the problem is in terms of usually adequacy. We get to kind of set aside the economics and just make sure we have enough machines in the ground to meet a sort of peak need. And in almost every other region, that's what you do. You add up the number of machines, you look at the peak load from the last few years, you adjust for temperatures, and you say, okay, I want to have some percentage above that to be safe. In our system, if you had a situation where there was a lot of sales and water has flown down a river and it doesn't come back up, you might just not have the fuel to make sure that you can meet those needs. And so you have to take into account the economics as well. And that's a huge challenge. It's a computational problem that is far beyond what normal ISOs and RTOs do throughout the rest of the country, and has always been one of the challenges that you would ever have if you tried to stand up a system like that in the Northwest, because it's just a very different level of computational challenge than what might be currently used in like the California ISO or MISO or other places like that.
Okay, thanks. Nancy, do we have any questions ready to go?
We do. It's Jay Ward has a question targeted for Elaine, but I think it's broadly for all the panelists. Jay, you want to jump in?
Sure. Last week, the president announced an executive order which prohibits utilities from investing in bulk energy technology from certain countries. And I'm wondering if, or not just for PG, but Elaine was talking at that time, how that might affect the acquisition of technologies like storage and DERs.
That's a great question. I wasn't on mute on purpose there, but I guess my response might feel a little bit like I'm on mute. I think I'd have to reach out to some of our policy folks to understand whether or not that has implications for us. I'm happy to follow up on that if you'd like.
So this is Fred. If I could actually take a swing at that, because I am following it. I would say, with Coalition, we don't have a particular position on this, but my personal observation is that there are issues with cybersecurity and other aspects of sourcing in the supply chain for the bulk energy system. My personal view is that this executive order is way overreaching and could potentially actually make it more difficult to maintain and to supply equipment into the transmission system that we've got in order to maintain reliability, and that then that supports the resources that then provide the resource adequacy. So I'm sure that I've already seen quite a few commentaries on this, a lot of discussion. The order is extremely vague in what it's going to do. There's a process going forward, and that's about all I know at this point. Nancy, do we have any other questions?
Yeah, I'm going to unmute Fred Gordon. Fred, you had a question about the heat map and shifting of peaks.
This is Fred Gordon for Elaine. You showed a heat map. I'm wondering, is the illustration came up specific to a particular year? And how much or little do those peak hours, time of day, drift over time or drift based on your assumptions about solar build?
I believe that the year for that was 2025. That's sort of the primary year of focus for our most recent planning cycle and for our procurement efforts coming up here. And what we've seen from California in particular is that those bright red areas in the summer have been creeping to later and later hours of the day as you've got more and more solar on your system. I'll say our solar resource up here isn't nearly as good as it is in California, and so while we expect to see some of that effect, I'm not sure that it'll be as dramatic as what they've observed down there and in the Southwest, but it's embedded. Sort of the solar that we have already is embedded in that result, so that has some solar already sort of anticipated to come online that's affecting where that red area is showing up in the summertime in particular. And as we update our analysis, we'll see it move around. It also, though, is affected by, when we go out and we sign contracts, regardless of the resource type, or we have an update to our load forecast, if we have additional saturation of air conditioning load, things like that. So we see those peaks, sort of the severity of them, move around a little bit over time and change in terms of their magnitude, depending on a lot of factors, but solar is definitely one of them.
Any additional thoughts, Teresa or Ben? If not, Nancy, let me go on to another question actually related to that, which is about hybrid resources. A hybrid is kind of a broad, not entirely defined category that typically looks at solar and battery storage or wind and battery storage, on the same site within the same facility. I'll note that the California ISO is at this moment having a workshop on their new proposal on dealing with hybrid resources, because it's more than half of their transmission queue now, and we're seeing those projects starting to show up in the Northwest. The purpose of that is to take renewable energy and to shape it a bit more so it's better for the system and address some of the peak needs and some of the ramping issues. So I'm wondering for any of you, your thoughts about how to model that and include that in the resource adequacy assessment.
I can tell you what we've done so far and some of the challenges with it, and sort of keeping in the vein of some of my prior responses. But we took a look at a hybrid solar plus storage resource in our last IRP, and to do that, we had sort of an outboard model that took the solar shape and looked at our needs, and then dispatch the storage with being fed by the solar to figure out, okay, what might be a reasonable shape be for a hybrid resource. And so you end up kind of giving it the same treatment that you'd give any variable resource, but just with a shape that's been adjusted a little bit to better sort of better meet the needs that we have on our system. So it's not sort of like a dynamic dispatchable resource like you might model a standalone energy storage system. And one of the reasons that we've taken that approach so far is that one of the big benefits of co-locating storage, in particular with solar, is qualifying for the federal investment tax credit. And that carries with it some requirements about how you operate the system and feeding the storage resource with the solar itself. And so that puts some constraints on operations. I guess it's another question, once you're through that period where you have those constrained operations, how you might better operate that type of system. And we're kind of not there yet, but it's on our radar in terms of interesting questions that we need to be asking.
Yeah, I just add to that, we've looked at some of the similar sort of questions around this. And I mean, in addition to the ITC, you often have panels in a solar plant that are oversized for the inverter. So there's often kind of natural energy that could be stored there that would basically have been spilled otherwise. So there's some real good alignment with having storage and solar co-located, or storage, solar and wind in some combination thereof. But especially with the solar plants where you have that oversized panel to inverter relationship, it can be a huge benefit. And I totally agree with Elaine on kind of how you would maybe, especially early on, model these things. And I think you want to take our history as an indication. Like early on, the way we modeled wind was very different than when we started to have a huge penetration of it in the Northwest. And that wasn't because we were modeling it wrong early on. The first few things that come into the system are going to be operated differently than when you have a huge stack of that resource laying around and you might have a different need that it's addressing. So I think early on, the right way to address it is to look at what's the economic signal right now, and you look at where the storage would naturally move that to. And if you have a very small amount of that resource relative to the entire generating pool of the West, or the utility you're looking at, or for us, the region you're looking at, it might be a pretty natural thing to kind of look at that as a fixed operation. But as you get a lot of storage on the system, you might look at it more dynamically and be more concerned about, okay, holding it even later into the evening, looking at how it could supplement reserves or anything like that. Of course, taking into account if it's getting an ITC, that you need to make sure that you respect the requirements there for that.
And I'll offer this could be one of the benefits or drawbacks of doing a regional program is so you end up with a single counting method, right? So rather than PGE looking at it saying, well, this is how we're going to count it, and other utilities looking at it saying, well, this is how we're going to count it, you end up with a single counting method. But when we talk to the California ISO, when you talk to the Southwest Power Pool, they'll say, what's the biggest challenge in this? It's getting to the counting method, right? Because it's not an exact science, right? There's a certain amount of art to it, and it does depend how many resources you have on the system. And so I'm really interested, actually, as we continue through the process with the power pool and with the stakeholders and in public meetings, right? How do people feel about having potentially a single counting method? Because it's going to be important in terms of how hybrid resources get treated, and other resources as well.
I like to say I can't say that there have been many game changers in my career, but the hybrids really look like one of those. So thanks for that. Nancy, do we have any questions waiting at this point?
Oh, we do. Adam Schultz, looks like maybe he dropped off the line. So I don't see him anymore. I can. Well, it's specifically for Elaine, and so I will. We'll pass those on to her, and so I won't ask that right now.
Yeah, we're getting down to the last few minutes here, so I think it'd be fine for anybody to ask any question at this point for a couple more minutes. I've still got one more I could ask if we don't have any, but let's throw it open.
All right, we're getting a few more. Barbara? Chevalier, I am unmuting you. Barbara, you want to go? Okay, her question is there anything that average citizens can do to support resource adequacy at a scale that would be meaningful, aside from responding to demand side incentives or installing solar panels? Is there particular advocacy or public education or other activity that would be useful? Okay, I asked Barbara's question. Any responses from
I'm going to throw that to Elaine, because I'm going to say that as somebody who's in PG&E's territory, there are a few things that you can do. Obviously, I'm signed up with their demand response program for thermostats, and there's some other things like that. So
Yeah, I think that's the first thing, is to look for your local utilities demand response programs, and also, even if they don't have programs, and if you're able to conserve during those times when, as an educated citizen, the system is strained, pretty much any time that you want to use your air conditioner, a lot of other people want to too. So if you want to be a good citizen, the first thing might be just to consider conserving a little bit. I'd say that another, we have folks participate in our IRP process who aren't affiliated with any organization, but just have an interest in the energy system and the changes that are occurring in the sector, and they want to participate. And so I would say that that's also a great opportunity to engage. And I think that the last thing, there's sort of there's an interesting dynamic going on right now in the conversations around both resource adequacy and clean energy policies. And I think that there's a natural tension, or a natural sort of inclination to see those things as in tension with one another. But there are actually a lot of clean energy technologies that are in support of resource adequacy. In fact, all clean energy technologies are in support of resource adequacy, just to varying degrees. And so I think just becoming more educated about these resources, and sort of understanding how these things can be happening sort of in concert with one another, the pursuit of resource adequacy and also the continued cleaning of the grid, is really important. And you can be doing advocacy with the organizations that you work with to see that those things aren't necessarily in conflict as well.
yeah, and I should add, I guess, to that energy efficiency is always a good thing. It supports resource adequacy. So if you have reached out to your utility and looked at what are the opportunities for energy efficiency, whether it's at home or at work or other places like that, that's always something that you can do directly as a citizen.
And I would add, and I can speak for the coalition on this, I think a really important thing is support the clean energy transformation. We've done a lot of that. Portland General Electric has listened to that and has changed their approach. Maria Prope, their CEO, was on the quarterly earnings call with Wall Street people about a week and a half ago, and she specifically mentioned that the utilities are listening, and the regulators and the governing boards for the public power utilities. And we have a strong direction in this region, but public support is really, really important.
Okay, I want to unmute Linda Irvine. She's got an interesting for our final question before we thank you all. Linda, you're still on the line?
Yes, I'm here. This is the obvious question, but with COVID-19, what are the implications for resource adequacy planning? I'm just seeing that I haven't been into a commercial load in a month and a half, and my home use is going up. So overall, does it change capacity needs, or alternatively, does it change our sense of the magnitude of customer behavior change that is possible in a really short time?
It certainly is affecting electricity loads right now, and what your observations are pretty smack on for at least our system. We see lower lower loads associated with businesses, higher loads associated with residential customers. The question so that does a couple of things. It changes both the total load and also the timing of the load, because the nature of electricity demand is very different from a commercial space to a residential space. The big question, and from our perspective, we do long-term planning, is how long will those types of effects persist, and will there be longer-term effects because of, for example, closures of businesses that persist beyond the present crisis? It's something that we're trying to understand better. It's challenging when a situation is evolving so quickly, but we're looking at the data, and it's an area that our commission has flagged as important for us to be keeping them informed on and adjusting our plans as necessary as we see some trends emerge and things like that. So it's definitely important, and it's just hard right now as we're in the middle of it to understand sort of what the long-term implications are going to be.
So thanks, everybody. I'm going to turn it over to Nancy for any closing remarks.
No, I just want to thank Ben, Elaine, Therese, Fred, Kat Plimpton in our office for putting this together and participating, and all of you who've been on the line and asking excellent questions. Thank you so much. As I mentioned earlier, the recording and the slides will be put up on our website, and feel free to follow up with us if you have any questions, any further questions or needs. Thank you all. And if you have feedback, please reach out to Kat. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.